podcast about Canadian cinema and our relationship with film. Today, we are discussing The Changeling, released in 1980, directed by Peter Medak, written by Russell Hunter, William Gray, and Diana Maddox. To join me today in discussing this, I have with me Hallie Walsh. Hallie,
Hello.
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good. Glad to finally be sitting down and talking about this.
I'm so excited.
When this podcast, setting up the first few episodes, I approached you and Skylar, running the production company, Eldritch Creative, that is responsible for this podcast. I know I wanted the two of you to be my first guests just to kind of, let people that might be interested in what you're doing find out more about you guys. So obviously I talked to Skylar last week, but, I approached you and you came back to me with The Changeling, and I'm really glad that you did. But before we get into all of this, who are you?
My name's Hallie. I am, as you said, co-founder for Eldritch Creative. I'm also a writer for Eldritch Creative in general, and I love spooky things. It kind of goes to say with our production company, a lot of the stuff we do is kind of spooky in nature. So when you approached and said, hey, I want to do this podcast, and I'm all for encouraging people to go out and watch Canadian films and kind of discover Canadian films through this podcast, I was like, yeah, that's awesome. So, that's me in a nutshell.
Awesome. One of the interesting things about doing this podcast that I found so far is that when, somebody approaches me and they're interested to be on the podcast, and I ask them what film they want to cover, quite often, my brain does a little bit of a reset and I just kind of go, that makes sense. It kind of makes sense that, like you said, with you being a writer and liking spooky things, The Changeling is a well-written spooky film. It makes tons of sense that you would want to choose it. On that note, what is The Changeling? Not to be confused with the absolutely forgettable Clint Eastwood film from a few years ago.
No, this one's from 1980, starring George C. Scott and Trish Van Devere. The synopsis of this one, if I had to kind of condense it there, would be it's a man coping with the loss of his daughter and wife in a freak accident, moving into an old, gorgeous mansion in Seattle, only to discover that he's not alone in the mansion. And he has to then unravel this mystery of what this entity in the house is, who it is, and why it won't leave him alone, why it's reaching out to him.
You summed that up way better than I could, let me tell you there. Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty about The Changeling and why you chose this film and what you have to say about it, just going to share a couple of little tidbits that I discovered while researching this show. I think the most superficial is that Martin Scorsese picked this film as one of the 11, seems like a random number, but 11 scariest films of all time.
That's pretty cool.
So I thought that was pretty cool.
Good vote of confidence there.
I think for me, the most interesting bit of trivia that I found out for this, and it's a very Canadian piece of trivia, is that this film cleaned up at the first ever Genie Awards in 1980. The Genie Awards, which, if people know it at all, mainly refer to it as the Canadian Oscars. Before that was just the Canadian Film Awards, which, doing research about that, some years they don't even know what won the award. The awards are given out by the Academy of Canadian Cinema and Television. At the very first Genie Awards, I'm just going to run down this really, really quickly. It won Best Canadian Film, Best Foreign Actor, and Best Foreign Actress. I think that it is an award that they only kept around for a few years before they just had Best Actor and Best Actress. Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Art Design, Cinematography, Sound, and Sound Editing, which I can't say I disagree with any of those awards, but those last few on the production end, I can completely 100% agree with when it comes to this movie.
Oh, absolutely. I cannot praise the set and the sound enough in this film because it is so perfect for the atmosphere. It added so much to the atmosphere. It just was bang on for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Just while we're still in the sort of fact area of this episode, just to touch upon where this movie was made, it was mainly filmed in Vancouver and Victoria, both places which I have lived in my life, with exterior location shots done in New York and Seattle. Obviously, the movie is supposed to take place in Seattle. That makes sense. And I believe from the looks of it, all the scenes shot at the very beginning before he moves to Seattle, I think, were the New York exterior shots. A lot of the interiors of the school were shot at University of Toronto. A couple of those I kind of recognized a little bit. But most interestingly, all of the interiors were shot at a movie lot in Vancouver. They constructed the entirety of the inside. And we're going to touch base upon this later because the production design is kind of what I lean into in my interest in these films. But this isn't about me. This is about you. So now that we have all the sort of extraneous bits and bobs out of the way there, out of the first few episodes that we're going to do, yours stands out because, as I've talked about before, I have very little control over what we talk about. I need to have somebody that wants to talk about a film to talk about it. And one of the trends that I've noticed is that so far, for the most part, all the movies that have been picked to be talked about are after 1990. I think that's the best way to kind of put a nutshell on it. A lot of genre and post 1990. And, on the show, I want to talk about every sort of film that I can. So when you came up with talking about The Changeling, as previously stated, done in 1980, or released in 1980, I should say, I was very happy just to get a different type of film in here from a different time period of Canadian cinema. So I'm going to hand this off to you. Why The Changeling?
Oh, well, I can already kind of feel my mom cringing somewhere in Grand Pré there. So a little background on me, which I could have covered earlier, but both my parents are actors. And my mom in particular introduced me to a lot of films growing up. My grandfather, also a huge influence on me. Every year for Christmas, I'd get at least one movie. So I have a very extensive movie collection. And I also really like ghost stories, which is kind of a bit of a paradox because I'm also scared of ghost stories. But I really love a well-crafted ghost story. And for me, a well-crafted ghost story doesn't mean a lot of jump scares. It doesn't mean gore or violence. It means I want to be unnerved. This movie is one of the best ghost movies I've ever seen in my life. And I first saw it when I was 7 years old. So this is why my mom will be cringing. I was born in Toronto, and when I was younger, my parents divorced and my mom moved us out here. And we moved into this old house, this 250-year-old house with a lot of creepy old furniture in it. I love the house now, obviously. But we just moved there a couple of years ago when she first showed me this film. I saw it and I would not go upstairs or downstairs in the dark for months because I was so scared. There are a couple of scenes in this movie that I think are the best shot things I've ever seen. One of them is a wheelchair. There is a wheelchair in this movie, and it is creepy as fuck.
With this movie, it's always interesting tackling these films because the amount of information out there about them varies greatly. I considering this one the first Genie Award for Best Canadian Film, I had a hard time finding information. I had to kind of pick little bits out of various reviews. And I can't remember what website it was, but one reviewer basically said that the wheelchair deserved an Oscar.
The wheelchair did deserve an Oscar. It's a really interesting escalation with this object, too, because the first time you see it, it's covered in cobwebs, it's dusty, it's been locked in a room, hidden away in this massive house. And as soon as the people see it for the first time, and they leave the room, it just moves very subtly. Very subtle. And the next time you see it, no one put it there. It's at the top of a huge set of stairs. Like, that's terrifying to me. How did it get there?
Well, it's interesting. I watched this movie. I hadn't seen this movie for a very long time. I think I had only seen it once years ago. It was mainly, ticking off a box, going through like the greatest horror movies ever made and stuff like that. And I liked it. I mean, I just have to say here, I love George C. Scott as an actor, and I think he's awesome in this. He plays a protagonist that you don't really see in horror movies too often, which is a professional, rational man who just outright just believes what he is seeing and just wants to get down to the bottom of it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You very rarely see that. He's very level-headed throughout the whole film. And last time that I watched it, it was really funny. There was almost like a Scooby-Doo-ish quality to it. Just
a little bit, yeah.
It's, like a Nancy Drew Hardy Boys sort of thing about like, we're going to get to the bottom of this. And it's just a very George C. Scott performance and a very naturalistic performance, which I really like.
One of the things about his performance that I love, and it's the way the character is written, is his way of dealing with grief. He's not just burying it all. There are some really raw moments where he's dealing with his grief and the loss of his daughter and his wife.
Which, when we talk about the screenplay and the topic of grief, because, I mean, grief is definitely the biggest thematic takeaway that I get from this film. It's a theme that very rarely is front and center in films. I can only think of a few off the top of my head. I think about like Don't Look Now and Inside Llewellyn Davis as a really good example where grief is not only a part of the character, but a motivator to drive the plot forward. One thing I find really interesting about the screenplay is it's weird. Well, to set up, we kind of got a little bit ahead of ourselves. George C. Scott plays John Russell. And at the very beginning of the film, I guess their car has broken down and they're pushing it God knows where. And they find this like phone booth, and he goes into the phone booth, at which point a large, carrier truck careens off the road, striking the car and the wife and daughter while he's standing there. That sort of sudden loss of someone, particularly both your wife and child, is something that's incomprehensible.
And to witness it.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's a difference when somebody, a family member or a loved one is sick and you can prepare for it. But to just have it ripped away. And I find it interesting, and I found it really kind of jarring on my first rewatch. It almost immediately cuts to like a few scenes later. He's just rationally having a conversation with a couple of friends.
Yeah.
And he's just kind of like, well, I was kind of in a haze for a bit. And then I kind of sat back and it's like, well, my wife and child are dead and I better just go and do something.
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing,
right.
Obviously, but that's very much it. And I find it interesting. It's not until just over 20 minutes into the film, you just see him lying in bed, bawling his eyes out.
Yeah.
And it is a weird thing. Like compartmentalizing grief is something, obviously people do. And I just find it very fascinating that we don't see, other than when he's watching it and witnessing it, the first time we see an emotional reaction, again, it's just him sobbing his eyes out in bed. And then immediately afterwards, he's back together. And when this mystery starts unfolding, he's, again, very rational talking about this stuff. And it's interesting reading reviews, researching this. There's a lot of varied opinions about George C. Scott's performance, and there are detractors. But I think that one of the things that a lot of people miss about his performance is that how grief can be compartmentalized, and how you just bury it. And I think part of his motivation in this movie to get to the bottom of this mystery, again, is just to do something to take his mind off, because his job as a composer almost seems secondary in the film. Like it kind of is used as a setting here, like a set piece here and there. But like, it's almost like, no, getting to the bottom of this mystery. And as I said before, his sort of like, well, I'm going to get to the bottom of this is part of his grief process. And I think it is such a hard thing to represent grief on film. And I commend his performance. And I think a lot of people miss that. I think they just read a very cold performance.
Yeah. And it's, I think, not just a way of like distracting himself. It's almost like by bringing this to a close, he can get some sense of closure himself. It's weird because he wants to help this ghost, this spirit, this child. But by doing that, it's almost as if he can save the child, the spirit, where he couldn't save his family.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, absolutely. I think you just really summed that up well there. I can't really add too much about it. Now, I'm trying to sit back here and I'm trying to think about, how old did you say when you were when you watched this? 7?
About 7 years old, yeah.
Yeah, it seems to be a common theme with this podcast is people watching films at an inappropriate age. I think I brought up with Skylar on his episode that my father let me watch films like The Godfather at a very early age as well. So it's interesting that this is something that kind of pops up here and there. So let's dive into this a little bit more. First off, did your mom I assume she knew what the film was about.
Oh yeah, my mom knew what it was about. She'd seen it. We have kind of a long-standing history in our family of showing the younger generations movies that influenced us when we were such an age. I got the opportunity to show my niece and nephew Nightmare Before Christmas a couple years ago, which was huge for me when I was a kid. So that was really exciting. So my mom had seen this and she really liked it. And knowing that I kind of like that spooky stuff like Nightmare Before Christmas and so on, she rented this and we watched it. Now it's definitely not as happy spooky as Nightmare Before Christmas.
For sure.
But it definitely influenced me as a writer and not just as, a kid that's afraid to go up and down the stairs in the dark.
It can't be said enough because I'm pretty similar. And my father never sat me down to watch films, but he always let me watch. I think his rule was as long as I didn't bother him, I could like hang out with dad. So I remember clearly like silently playing with my G.I. Joes while he was watching, like I said, The Godfather or, Casablanca. So I was exposed to a lot of these movies at a very early age. And yeah, definitely. I mean, exposure to this stuff, it is incalculable, the sort of influence that can have just on your tastes and your sort of openness towards film. Because that's one thing that jumped out. Like my father letting me watch these old films with him. When I got older films or slower paced films or however you want to look at it wasn't a thing. Like it was just a different type of movie. Whereas even still, I talk to people that they're like, oh, I can't watch this. It's too slow. Or, I'm shocked when I find somebody that says, oh, I can't watch a black and white film. But that exposure for me at such a young age really opened it up. So I'm really fascinated for you then. Like you said, that it influences you now. So what I'm interested in for you is how this influences you as a writer.
This movie definitely influenced me as a writer because it taught me something very important. I've seen a lot of horror movies, a lot of different genres of horror movies. Ghost movies, definitely my favorite of all the genres that there are. But what I think this has taught me most of all, and something that I try to pull from when I'm writing, is the scariest things in life are normal things behaving abnormally.
Like a ball bouncing down the stairs.
Like a ball bouncing down the stairs.
Probably
yes,
the most
Hunter.
famous image from this movie. Yeah.
It is.
And probably the most parodied as well.
That's right. Probably. So Dr. Russell, his daughter had a ball that when he moved, he put the ball in a desk that moved to the new house with him. One evening, the ball comes bouncing down the stairs in the dark to where he's standing at the bottom of the stairs. He knows something is up with the house at this point, so he takes the ball, gets in his car, drives to a bridge. He drops the ball off the bridge into the water. Very slowly.
To go back to George C. Scott's performance, it literally just rolls off of his hand. He doesn't angrily chuck it in. It just falls.
Because it's, on one hand, it's been touched by this ghost, but on the other, it's still his daughter's, right? And it's one of the few mementos he has left. So yeah, he's reluctant to drop it into the water, but he does. The next scene, he gets into the house, takes off his coat, and you hear something like water or like a little voice, and then the ball bounces down the stairs again and it's soaking wet. And that is one of the best, that I can still see that very vividly in my head. And so that ball, a normal object, behaving abnormally, being somewhere it's not supposed to be, in a condition it's not supposed to be in, that's huge for me.
And what really separates, in this film, what really separates it from a lot of other ghost films as well, is that it's also really a film about communication. Like, it's the house trying to, or not the house really, but the ghost. I kind of go back and forth how much of it is the house and how much of it is the ghost. Is it,
I think it's entirely the ghost. I think.
But it's almost like with the ball, he's trying to play with him.
Yeah.
Or get his attention. Obviously, we should get into the rest of the film, what it's about, but, to try to entice him up to the room, eventually literally like shooting out the window when he's leaving out the house one time, like just exploding outwards. And he kind of looks up curiously and he's like, what's in that room?
Yeah.
And that what kind of drives him to discover. So I don't know. Do you want to share what the rest of the film is like? We haven't talked about why it's called The Changeling.
Well, yeah, that's a pretty critical part of the movie. And I hope at this point, anyone who hasn't seen it, hopefully they're not going to worry about spoilers too much.
I will post a few days ahead of time that we're going to be releasing this episode. So they will have a few days to watch this.
Then.
And
they've been warned.
It's a pretty easy to find film.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I think you can find, it's easy to find.
Rent it from your library. I'm sure they have it.
Yeah. So the reason this film is called The Changeling is because the ghost in this house is that of a murdered young boy. He was very sickly. His father, because his father had a huge fortune, and it seemed unlikely that this child was going to live past a certain age because he was so young, which would mean the end of his line, essentially. So rather than have that happen, his father drowns him in a tub.
I have this in my show notes from one of my watches in a very weird way.
He
doesn't like hold him under. He literally just yanks. It's one of the things that sucks to me. Like kind of like holds his feet out of the water a little bit and just slides the son down. And I know it's an odd thing to bring up, but it's something that really stuck with me.
Well, the boy's been sick
when I was watching
and can't use his legs, right? So he can't use his legs. The wheelchair, the aforementioned wheelchair, belonged to him. And so he drowns his son, but then makes it seem like he's taking his son overseas to get well and ends up raising another boy that looks similar to him in his place. And that's the changeling. He becomes this changeling because the boy comes back from overseas getting help and he's cured, which is a miracle, right? And this boy goes on to then become the senator or a
very important political figure. I can't quite remember.
Political figure in the community. So the changeling, that's where the name comes from, that swapping of bodies. And the boy that replaced the original the changeling knows that he was a changeling and has known this the entire time.
But like, just to add, then this is where the sort of Scooby-Doo element kind of comes into it, that, you know, George C. Scott then sets out to try to prove, or
That's right.
It's vague as to what his actual end goal is. It almost seems like he just wants the guy to admit it.
Which I think is what he thinks the ghost wants.
Yeah.
Because it's been a secret this whole time, and this ghost has had no rest. So then George C. Scott's character, Dr. Russell, wants to prove that this happened and bring this to light and give this ghost some closure.
I think here's a good time to drop. There's one interesting part of this movie that research brought up, which is the main credited screenwriter, Russell Hunter, wrote it. Apparently, it's based on a true story.
I did read
An experience that he had. The more I kind of went down this rabbit hole, it's interesting. He only has one other established film credit other than this. A film, I know nothing about it, released, I think, 7-8 years later. But he was a noted playwright and composer, hence where the composer aspect, I think, came in. So apparently a lot of this is biographical, even down to, the murdered boy being replaced, living in this old house, it being haunted, even down to the seance, which we definitely have to get to the seance scene. But apparently this was all based on, and I just wanted to share this one note. This is from because it was in Denver where he lived in the old house. And this is off of a website for, I think, the Denver Historical Society, talking about that house.
Okay.
He talks about how the haunting would go on. A lot of it plays out similar to the movie, saying that glass doors blew up in my face and severed an artery in my wrist. The inner walls over the head of my bed violently imploded. This is an interview with him. And then it notes, Hunter then left the house and only returned to it again to watch its demolition, to make way for a high-rise apartment building. He remarked of the raising, as the walls of the wing which had contained my bedroom collapsed, they suddenly flew outwards and crushed to death the man operating the bulldozer.
Oh my God.
And then the paragraph after that is, as Phil Goldstein points out in his 1996 book, The Ghosts of Denver, Capitol Hill, the historical details in Hunter's story don't exactly check out. So I thought that was a funny little thing to add. So it stands to see how much of a true story it was actually based on. But it was definitely an interesting selling point. I'm kind of reminded of the Amityville Horror in that.
Yeah.
That, people purporting that it's based on a real story, no matter how factual, definitely piques a little bit more interest, or like in a Blair Witch kind of way, right?
For
Thinking
sure.
that a part of it might be real. I do want to talk about the production design, but we talked earlier about wanting to talk about the seance scene.
Oh, the seance scene,
Let me just say, I am a big fan whenever movies use automatic writing.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not a big believer of this sort of stuff, but the concept of automatic writing, I think, is really, really cool. I'll hand it back to you. Again, I'm talking enough. Talk about the seance scene.
Well, it's not just the seance scene, but it's after. I could be misremembering here, but I'm pretty sure what happened was they had the seance and some things happened. But then it wasn't until after, when he was listening to the tape again on his own, that he picked up on a little voice answering the questions. It wasn't just, she was recording it during the seance, and then after, he could hear the voice of the boy on the tape answering as she was writing, just before she wrote down the answer, thus proving that she was hearing the boy, but also hearing that voice, that tiny child voice. Oh, I still get shivers. I still get shivers thinking about it.
Definitely. And again, to go back to George C. Scott's character, I find the lead up. Last night when I watched it, I rewound the scene a couple of times because I find it interesting, because yet again, talking about the character, he's in a hospital and he's like, well, I don't know what to do now. He's talking to a physician, I think a psychologist. And the psychologist is like, well, we've dealt with a lot of, mediums. He's basically like, 99% of them are bunk, but 1% of them,
know what they're doing.
Knew what they're doing. So George C. Scott is just like, okay, then it's a seance. And he seems to be a little bit hesitant, but he's still just straightforward, open to like try to figure out what's going on here.
And I think it's worth noting too, because that wheelchair shows up again. He invites over Trish Van Devier's character to come and listen to the seance tape.
Who was the realtor that got him the house in the first place.
Yeah,
correct?
she worked for the Historical Preservation Society in the town and hooked him up with the house in the first place.
Which they say had been empty for like 12 years.
Yeah, it had been empty for a long time. And he invites her over and she listens to the tape and she's so distraught hearing it. And she kind of careens into the hallway and turns around and she just freezes because he comes into the hall and looks up at the top of the stairs and there's the wheelchair that had been locked in the room where the little boy had been hidden for most of his life at the top of the stairs. And it's worth mentioning too, this house is not like 2 levels, it's 3 or 4 levels high. And this chair silently got to the top of the first set of stairs. And do you know why now I'm afraid of wheelchairs?
Well, no, I love talking to you about this because like just the look in your eyes, you're like, and then there's this, like you're really getting into recounting it.
It's true. Well, it left an impression. It did. I think it's safe to say I'm not a fan of empty wheelchairs. I don't like seeing them, especially the old wicker ones. So,
well, and this is all kind of building up to the production design, but it's also the way that the house is shot. Like it's such an isolating thing because even he comments at the beginning of the film that he's like, this is a huge place.
Yeah.
Just for me. And I can't even remember, like, does he actually say why he ends up settling to stay there? I think he just falls in love with the music room.
Yeah.
There's a music room where he can sit and compose.
Yeah. It's kind of isolated and he just wants time to himself to work on his music. And I think that's why he liked it so much. It's got that beautiful music room. And it would be perfect for what he's looking for.
Yeah, definitely. And I do really enjoy a lot of the music scenes. There aren't a lot, but one of my rewatches was with my friend Sally, and she has a music background. And one of the things she instantly commented, she's like, those people are actually playing their instruments. Mm-hmm. You know, and that was something that I just didn't even think to look at, but that was her point of view. Just to step to the side really quickly, because we've really been building to the production design. We've been talking about the house and everything. You have a show with Skylar, a podcast, Silver Screen Anomalies, where you contrast and compare films.
Yep.
One thing I'm just going to throw out there, I know you tend to do a lot more recent stuff, but A.O. Scott's review from the AV Club about this film made an interesting point. He referred to this film as a more comforting alternative to The Shining, 1980s other haunted house film.
Yeah.
And I think they'd be a very interesting films to contrast. I mean, The Shining, of course, would be another conversation unto itself. But immediately when you bring up that they came out in the same year, and I think about that whenever I see the opening scene of the snowy highway. Yeah. And of course, The Shining opens up with a snowy highway shot as well. Like they established, but they both explore their themes in very, very different ways. But I just wanted, because of your podcast, I wanted to bring up that contrast, that it wasn't until I read that interview that I was like, oh yeah, The Shining came out in 1982. So you have these two really great quote unquote haunted house films at the same time.
Yeah, that's true. It would make a really interesting contrast and comparison to kind of review those two movies side by side and see how they fare.
Well, you can take that idea for your podcast if you want. I won't get possessive of it. Do you have anything you want to add before we get to the production design?
I don't think so. No. Let's talk about the production design, because honestly, the set, the score, everything was top notch for me. And I mean, obviously I have some like ties to it from my childhood that maybe today's audience wouldn't appreciate it as much as I do, but they are really worth mentioning for sure.
Well, as I said, at the Genie Awards, it won Best Art Design, Best Cinematography, Best Sound, and Best Sound Editing. The sound in this movie, amazing. The score is great. It's a Canadian composer. I don't have that who that is right off the top of my head.
Well, the score is so beautifully done too. It's eerie, it's melancholy, it's sad, it's just beautifully done, and it's not overdone. It uses it to punctuate certain moments, but overall, it doesn't really use it to draw attention to something spooky going on. It just adds to the atmosphere.
Definitely. Rick Williams. Sorry. Rick Williams is the name of the composer. Took me a second here. My notes were a little bit messy for this one. Yeah, and also with the classical music, like I said, the film doesn't really lean into him being a composer that much, but balancing the natural score and the film score, blending them together, there was a lot of interesting soundtrack transitions. And then, going to the sound of the film and the overall sound design, I mean, the creaks, the groans, you don't get much better in a haunted house film than the sounds that you get from this movie. It's one of my regrets not seeing it in the theaters, that I think with like a good sound system, this movie would just sing, for lack of a better term.
I would love to see this on the big screen. As long as there was somebody there who could put up with my going, wheelchair, every now and again.
I now know what random pictures to send you on social media to freak you out.
Oh, I see my errors now.
Okay, and now let's talk about this house, because
a
little bit behind the scenes here, how I usually approach this podcast is that I will watch the movie cold, then I will do my research, and then I rewatch it and make show notes with what I learned from the research. So I watched the movie cold, great, and then I do my research, and my mind was blown that all the interiors were on a soundstage, which totally I missed. This movie is a set designer's dream, because number one, it's a gorgeous space.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the design of the house is just absolutely beautiful. But you get to set design it in different stages. Like when it's first, they first move in and it's all cobwebby, and then the different stages of him moving in. And then later on in the movie when he's having people over and you have quote unquote modern furniture, very late 70s sort of couches and stuff like that. So I really like that a lot. And it wasn't until my rewatch that I noticed that, of course, because it's on a soundstage, when people are entering the house from outside, it's kind of just black in the background. You don't really see out the windows from inside the house. So they just did a fantastic job with that.
They really
and I
did.
would have loved to have walked around that set.
Oh, it would have been
just
great.
to see, how it is and, the different rooms and how they would have them set up on the soundstage. It would have been fascinating. Do you have anything that you want to add to that? I mean, you were.
No, I mean, I would have.
We touched upon the house in bits and bobs, but I wanted
Yeah.
to just really kind of focus on how great the set design really is on this.
Oh, yeah, no, I would have loved to have walked around that set because it would have been a real study in engineering for sure. Like, there's just so many components to that.
We'll just get right to the end of the film. And I brought this up to you before. I really think one of the reasons why they built it on a soundstage is just so they could burn that crap down.
Oh, yeah.
At the end of it and
Yeah,
just trash
that's right.
it. It's kind of interesting that, it's almost like Bridge on the River Kwai, where they, build up to actually blowing up the bridge. I really think that they just waited until the end of production, then just dumped lighter fluid on everything and just burned it down.
It's entirely possible.
Yeah. So let's talk about the actual end. This movie ends abruptly.
It does.
The end of this movie, to bring in, I think at least one episode I have to bring in a random film off the cuff. It really got a lot of vibes of Chinatown. Like the old corrupt politician and finding the dark story behind it, because it is interesting, the sort of politics. Like when they leave the house, it's a very different film, especially when they're going, like trying to interview the senator or whatever political figure he is. And then, it's almost like, how would you describe the ending? Like what happens at the very end? You've been so much better than me about, synopsizing this.
I think that this movie ended in the only way that the ghost would want it to end, which is essentially, so through the whole movie, they've unraveled this changeling plot. They found the corpse of the young boy. They find it in a well under a house, which is a whole scene onto itself.
That whole part of the movie, yeah, absolutely. We could have a conversation about that. It's like a little mini movie. And like I said, that's where it starts to get really kind of Scooby-Doo.
It does.
Yeah.
So they find the corpse of the boy in the well, and they also find a medallion that belonged to him that the changeling has an imitation of. So when George C. Scott's character drops off this medallion to the changeling, it triggers something. The ghost is then on a revenge streak, it seems to me, because at the end of the movie, the house is burning, and George C. Scott's character sees the changeling, the old man, walking up the stairs in a trance, and these stairs are just in flames, and the stairs then collapse. And the man's trapped in there, and the house burns down.
And that's the end of the film.
That's the end of the film.
You basically cut away to an establishing shot of the house burning down from the outside, which is one of the reasons it's interesting. The exteriors were filmed in Victoria, BC, but apparently they built the entire outside facade of the house.
Yeah, they couldn't
And I think that
find
was,
one.
again, as well, I think, because they could burn it down.
Possibly, yeah.
Afterwards, and not have to burn down a real house,
Yeah.
before CGI. And then it just ends.
Well, the last shot of the whole movie, and this is kind of where it's questionable to me whether the ghost is satisfied with the death of the changeling and all of this coming to light, because the very last shot of the film, as the credits are rolling, is I think it's the wheelchair that's outside the remains of this house, these skeletal beams and everything burned from the fire. There's the chair sitting outside and a music box that was in the boy's room. And the music box just starts playing. And it's like, did it just do that? Or is the ghost still sitting in that chair?
Well, what do you think?
I like to think that the ghost moved on. I like a happy ending, or at least a very satisfying ending.
Yeah.
And I'd like to think that there's nothing left tying him to the world now that all of this has come to light and that the changeling is gone as well. That's what I'd like to think anyway.
Which is, really interesting because, it really does focus on the ghost. Like you don't find out about what happened to George C. Scott's character afterwards, or what happened to John Russell.
What happened to all his stuff?
Because
all his stuff's burned.
All burned, but, it ends up being like not his story. You don't find out if he gets a resolution with his family from this. And like I said, that's one thing that always kind of throws me off about the abrupt ending. Is that it's just like, and now we're done.
Yeah, it's
like it's like an axe fallen.
It is, yeah. It's kind of got that final cut, and you're just like, but I have questions.
So Before we go on to the last couple of notes here, do you have anything else you want to say about The Changeling at all? Any takes? Like I said, this is another movie that there's a lot to unpack. I'm sure there's a lot of scenes. There's, the ghost does kill somebody partway through the movie.
I don't think so. I think that this movie, you got to take it with a grain of salt if you've never seen it before. It was filmed at a different time. Different techniques were used. I find it still very frightening, but I have shown it to people who have been like, it was all right. It wasn't that scary. I don't know. Maybe it was because 7-year-old me saw it first, but this is one of my top 5 ghost movies. If you ever really want a good study of a good ghost story, this is a good movie to watch.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. And I want to get what your entire top 5 is at some point, because if I haven't seen them, I want to watch some of them. Okay, so obviously, Canadian Film Podcast, this is a Canadian film. What I find interesting about it, though, is that this is kind of like the farthest end of Canadian film in terms of production that I'm willing to do. And what I mean by that is that, the main stars are American, the director was British, it was filmed in Canada. As I said, the composer was Canadian, but mainly this is a Canadian film because it was filmed here and it had Canadian money. Yeah. Like, that is the Canadianness in this film. So, like I said, this is the most away from being Canadian that I think I want to talk about on this show. It's still great to have on the show. But what do you think this film says about Canada?
What it says about Canada is not only can we put out a really good ghost film, it also says we will find creative solutions to any problem. As Canadians, we came here. It's a harsh environment. There have been historically in literature, a lot of Canadian literature about the struggles of starting a life in Canada. But we found a way. And it's the same thing with when they couldn't find a mansion that fit the design for what they had in mind, they built it. They built the interior set on a soundstage, and they built the outside facade and put it in front of a house or a mansion. I think that says something about Canadians for sure.
Well, definitely. And on that note, I don't think we brought up that Peter Medak, the director, was actually the 3rd director attached to this film. And he was brought him in last second. He only had like a month to work on the script and finish that set construction. And you could never tell by watching that movie at all. No,
it was very solidly done. Yeah, we find a way.
Definitely, yeah. So, Hallie, unfortunately, we're getting the fingers on the wrist sign about time here. Again, I'm sure we could go on for at least another half hour or so about this movie. So, yeah, for you, what do you have in the pipeline? Anything you want to talk about? Anything that you have coming up?
Well, we've got Silver Screen Anomalies is coming up with another episode soon.
Can you say what you're going to be covering on that one?
No, I can't. Not yet.
Okay, you'll just have to subscribe like everybody else and find out that way.
Yeah, that's right. We also have another film to be shot in the not too distant future. That's going into pre-production. We got a few things coming up that are pretty exciting.
Well, definitely, yeah. I'm looking forward to them too.
You'll know about them.
Yeah. All right. So then to wrap things up, North of Normal is a production of Eldritch Creative. They can be found on Facebook at Eldritch Creative and Instagram at eldritch.creative. North of Normal can be found on Facebook at North of Normal Pod and Instagram at North of Normal Pod. Intro and outro music is by Dad vs. Son out of Hamilton, Ontario. That's it for this week. Be seeing ya.